The three versions of Judas.
Judases.
All right, jumping right into this. If you've been following along, we're working our way through Labyrinths, through most of Borges' short stories. Check out the playlist down below for more of his talks. This one, wow. Okay, let's put it this way. Basically, a guy wrote 3 essays is the plot, and the 3 essays present 3 different versions of Judas, essentially, and it gives you a conclusion. And then I think it just kind of ends abruptly. It's very just leaving it to the reader to say, well, what was the point of that?
Definitely one that you need to have a discussion afterwards. This is an amazing opportunity for, say, a classroom to read this and then say, okay, what do you think? Because, yeah, it ends so abruptly. But I like how he gives us footnotes and references, and it really does a good job of kind of blurring the lines of fiction and nonfiction and leaves it to the reader like so many authors do. But on this one, it is about a very well-known topic and something that kind of lends itself, I feel, to a very deep discussion. It's not a very light subject, right? The betrayal of Jesus by Judas.
Well, and to me, I guess I took it more meta because, I don't know, it's not hard. You end down those YouTube rabbit holes fairly easily. And something that I love to do is watch a lot of those debates between like an atheist or a staunch like Christian. And I like it better, like the more professional ones where they have a particular angle, they have angles of attack, and it's not like they're not coming at each other with like the rhetoric, which is always kind of boring. You can tell when someone's trying to lay a trap. It's pretty obvious. I like it when they actually have legitimate discussions about wrestling with, help convince me, like make a good argument for this, and they work through that. And I felt like that, maybe it's just because that's the rabbit hole I typically end down. I heard a lot of those voices through this about like, well, what does that mean when this happens? And to jump into it, like let's talk about the 3 ones. The first one, I think, is the one that, gosh, I struggle with all of these, to be honest, but it's basically that Judas is the necessary predestined instrument for Christ's redemption, meaning Judas never really had a choice. He was always predestined. I mean, there were prophecies, right? We knew Jesus was going to be, there was going to be a traitor in the midst, right? And Judas was the one. He had to be the one to end Judas's life. And what did that, or end Jesus's life, and what did that mean? And I think that poses some interesting questions because I'm not a Calvinist, right? From the whole, Armenian Calvinist debate and such, but so I'm not one to represent predestination well. But I do think that that's interesting to say, like, okay, if Judas was predestined to do this, what does that mean for his free will and his ability to be redeemed, considering he didn't have a choice in it? I think that's an interesting question.
Definitely opens up a hard discussion right off the bat of, if you don't have a choice, what does it matter? And that's a lot of times what we go to religion for is security of what happens to us after we're done in our meat suits, but also that we get a choice in the matter, because I think as humans, we like having choice. And Judas is just playing the role. I mean, that his role is to be the betrayer. And is he doing this out of choice, or is he doing it out of obedience to God? And that I think that's what a lot of people struggle with, right? Like if he is just chosen to do this, then what does that say about me and my choices? Do I really get to be this choice? And then I kind of went down the rabbit hole, not like exactly how you did, but I thought about this of like, how do we know the limits of our own minds, the limits of human understanding? A lot of times we've talked about, theologians have talked about, philosophers have talked about, you can't understand God. So how do you understand the sacrifice that he's asking Judas to make if he knows Judas is going to make it? That's where I struggle.
Well, I think that's the problem. He's not being asked in this first one, right? He is being forced. It is not his free will. It is not a choice. Judas is being relieved of the problem of choice.
Right.
Because,
yeah, no, I agree with you. I guess what I was saying is we don't understand from our limited perspective of how God is having this play out.
Well, it makes you wonder too, is always talk about how goodness existed and evil sin corrupted it. I believe is the translation of the words there. Again, don't take me for gospel here, obviously. But if God did this, would that make thus God the author of evil, to have forced that this is the way the events must unfold, predestined? That raises a very complicated question. And I guess my immediate knee-jerk reaction, like retort to that, which I'm not even fully convinced of myself, right, is, well, I guess knowing something will happen is not the same thing as causing. But at the same time, it doesn't feel totally good to say that too, because it's like, well, but God is all-powerful. Shouldn't he be able to cause things in a way that doesn't condemn a person who had no choice in the matter? Like, that's, I don't know, that's very difficult for my mind to wrestle with.
Agreed. And one final thing before we maybe move on to the second version is, we don't know this, right? But did Judas get salvation? Did he go to heaven or hell? I don't think it's clear. And how you ever interpret it of God could forgive anybody. Does he forgive Judas? Does Judas go to heaven? So then does that justify what he did? Because he was still forgiven in the end. He was a tool. He was a means to an end. That probably takes away from some of the validity isn't the right word, but you know what I mean? So I don't know.
No, I get it, because I do struggle with that too, because there's the whole, to me, like a lot of, like when we look at the Bible as a whole, like one of the most celebrated areas is Romans, particularly because of as sin increase, grace increases even more. And that is so hard to understand that, you know, he's creating a mortal sin, Judas, by doing the murder. And I guess he was always destined, it was always going to happen in this first scenario, that technically there is enough grace is enough that if God decided to save him, he could. And that just seems crazy that, like, if he could be forgiven because of that circumstance, because he was always chosen, then why wouldn't I be able to be saved for anything? And then that becomes the, what's the word? Like the antinomianism, where like you decide that like you can commit sin because grace could save you. Like it's something along those lines. I'm not representing it well, trust me, but that comes into the picture, and it becomes hard to articulate of, well, when is it my choice?
There's a lot of struggle of people, you know, what is it? There's a saying, I can sin Monday through Saturday and just ask for forgiveness on Sunday.
Yeah, you get the church high, feeling good for a couple hours, and then you're gonna go back to your what did you call yourself? A meat sack? Is that what you said?
Yeah, our meat sacks.
Oh gosh! All right, so maybe we should move on to point two, right? So Judas in this version, he's the true sacrifice, right? So it's like, well, okay, somebody's got to kill him. It says it in scripture. Someone has to betray him and murder him, right? All right, fine. I'll do it. I'll be the one to go for eternal darkness, hell, Sheol, whatever you want to call it, to save everyone else, right? Like, I will be the one to jump on the grenade, so to speak, that we can actually view him as being more selfless than Jesus Christ's sacrifice, because he saved all of humanity by sacrificing himself, right? It's the idea of, I compare it to the trolley problem, right? Like if I switch, this trolley's coming down the tracks and it's going to run over and kill 5 people, but you could switch the track and it only kills 1. What do? Right? Like that's one of those things of like, well, is it better to save 1 life, 5 lives, but then you directly cause the death of another life? Like it becomes one of those problems of, okay, I can save everybody's soul. Is it worth condemning one for that?
That's always the struggle. I saw this one almost as 2 sides of the same coin. You have Jesus on one side representing the holiness, the divine, and then Judas on the other side representing the sin/humanity. And that he is, if Jesus is the perfect lamb, unblemished God, then Judas is the perfect human with the most tainted of sins. Kills God, right? Indirectly. There can't be any more sin than that. There can't be any more worse betrayal than that, besides maybe, you know, the devil, Lucifer, whoever, however you want to kind of take the levels of sin. but this seems to personify human sin in an actual person. And it's hard because we're all fallible, but we're all able to have God's grace as well. So this is a tough kind of theological argument, I feel like, of what do you do, because you have to have Judas. He's a necessary evil.
It's like a dilemma of why would he create someone for the explicit purpose of betrayal and damnation, right? Like, how can that be part of the master plan in the context of a holy, good God? And that's a very common question. I don't think we're ever going to get the answer to that. But it is one of those things that you can struggle with, that like why were we created so weak? Why is this man necessary? His sin, his damnation necessary to save everyone else in an all-powerful world? But I guess it goes back to, I guess if he wanted to, grace would be enough for Judas, but we just don't know.
I thought about that a lot too. And I guess for me, it came down to this needs to happen to teach. It's a teachable moment. Obviously, it's to forgive sins of all mankind. If you believe in the sacrifice of Jesus, his only son / himself, to absolve all of us of our sins, then that is the most teachable moment. But there's also, again, to stick with my analogy of the one coin on two sides, it's you have to have the fall to get back up. Judas has to have sin in order to be redeemed. Now, we don't really know if he's redeemed or not, but the story isn't necessarily about him. It's about Christ and you and your redemption. If my understanding of it, again, my limited interpretation as a not even an armchair theologian.
Well, same here, right? Because it's like, let's say you put yourself, there's a modified trolley problem where, let's say you look down below and the trolley's coming towards these 5 people, right? And instead of like just flipping a switch to divert it, let's say the switch is down below as well. And there's an old man standing next to you. You could push that old man onto that lever to divert the trolley, save everyone except for the fact that the old man's going to fall to his death and die. That's kind of Judas's situation, right? Because he's not throwing himself. Like, he's not the one that's dying on the cross. He's literally pushing Jesus off the bridge for death to save 5 murderers and people who know are sinners and stuff like that. It's imagine that mindset of being on the bridge. Could you push the old man? I'm gonna guess a lot of people couldn't, right? And you know that if you don't, there's more people that are gonna die. Like that is such a hard situation to jump into, because it's like, why do I have the right to take someone else's life? You know what I mean? Like, why should I sacrifice Jesus to save everyone else's soul is a very difficult problem when you really put yourself in that situation.
I think it kind of brings us to like the last version that Borges presents to us is, or Runeberg's, the author inside of the story, is Judas, again, kind of coming back to full circle of, is he making this choice? Because to me, the third version, and in the story, the third version is the blasphemer version of, he's only a man, he's a traitor, but he knows what he's doing in this case, that he has to sacrifice God in order to save the rest of the people, and that he is almost a manifestation of God himself, which is, pretty heretical way of thinking.
I took it as he was like we don't use this word when like, it almost sounds like too flowery, I guess. Like, what do you say? He's filled by the Spirit, but that doesn't sound correct. But like, I almost want to use the word he was possessed by God, like God became him to do the action. And that is hard. That is hard as well, because then it's like, well, then God would be committing a sin. Like, you can't, because that would be morally corrupt of a perfect being. That doesn't work. Like, that can't happen, right? If this is a morally perfect being where sin came into the world to blemish goodness, right? then that would mean that perfect being, if he committed a sin, is not actually perfect, right? And that can't happen by law of God being perfect, right? So it's like that would be the hardest one, because then God became man to commit sin. And that is a complete undermining, I think, of the Christian theology, if you were to, I think, look at it that way. Again, my limited interpretation, but that seems contradictory.
We're in a theological paradox here, because if you look at the story in its entirety, not just the betrayal of Judas, you have God, who is Jesus himself. So he made himself into a mortal being. Now, and God created everything, so he created Judas as well. And in this third version, he becomes Judas, or Judas is his tool to sacrifice himself to save the people that he created. It's like, is there enough outside influence there, to your point, of actually creating a sin? Because it's all self-imposed. If you believe God created everything and that Jesus is God, creating himself to sacrifice himself using a tool that he created himself. It breaks people's minds, right? And this is where this debate goes, and I think that's why this story is so important, because it helps us discuss something that is so difficult to understand and comprehend.
Well, it's like, on a total personal level here, this week, I'm not even joking, this week, like my job, right? I'm going through this contract negotiation thing. And this vendor that we work with, their licensing strategy of like how we have to pay each year based on our usage and stuff like that, so complex. Like, you need a PhD in just contract negotiation to understand their licensing strategy. And so they pitched us this broader contract, essentially like an enterprise license contract. And they said, look, we solved the problem. We solved the licensing problem. We made it easier with this. And I looked at them and I laughed and I said, no, you don't get credit for solving something you created. You created that problem. You don't get credit for taking it away as if you're some savior. And I didn't think about it in this context, but here we are, like you just brought it up. Like, do you get credit for solving evil if you created it, right? Like, if you were the privation, essentially, that's another really interesting way to talk about this story. I don't know. To me, I got to be honest, the story was only like, like I didn't, like, as I'm reading it, it wasn't crazy, but like all Borges things, I got to bump it up in retrospect, this one particularly, because of like, these are like the rabbit holes I end down on YouTube. I just find it really interesting, the debate of like, let's talk about faith and blasphemy, and where do these two intersect. Let's talk about this concept of like this historical interpretation of these events, and what could that mean for ultimate beings and such. And I think it's a really healthy discussion to have, even if I don't have the answers. I just have more questions.
After I read this, I was talking to my wife about it, of how am I going to discuss this, and looking at the three versions of Judas, and we started discussing, and I kind of thought about this in more of a modern aspect of, you could look at Judas as almost an anti-hero. He's kind of like, I hate to see it, almost like a Deadpool. Like, he is a necessary evil, as I said, because he's a necessary player in the story. Like all of our favorite movies and our comics, Batman needs the Joker. Luke needs Vader. Frodo needs Sauron. Without them, your heroes, they might be lackluster. A hero is only as good as the villain. And this story, you have the ultimate villain, the betrayer of God. That makes this a great story that has lasted thousands of years and still teaches us to this day to try to be better.
Yeah. Well, in these patterns, these moral ambiguities, these certainties and boundaries between fiction and and true historical events is what makes it something that is just so compelling, that how much of our stories that we tell each other are influenced through these things throughout time. And I think that's what I love about Borges, is his ability to take these honest problems and struggle with them. And I don't feel like, I mean, we know Borges he's a very stout atheist throughout his life. And then, like everyone on his deathbed was just like, well, I don't know, should I pray? Like, he wasn't actually religious, but like you get those doubts, right? Like, what if I'm wrong, right? And I think it's important that people struggle with not necessarily Christianity, but that idea of how do I reconcile what I think is the purpose, is there a purpose? What happens when I die? Like, that is something that I think everybody has to touch on at least at some point in their life.
Yeah, that comes down to divine logic versus our human morality, and where does it intersect, and what does it mean to you on a personal level? What does it mean to you with your God, your relationship with your faith? And how do you justify what you do as sin? Because we all sin. And then how do you justify how you're going to be forgiven for that sin to have a better afterlife? And I think Judas couldn't do that. Or maybe he wasn't supposed to do that, right? He's a necessary evil.
He was always going to do it. You just didn't know it. Let us know in the comments down below what you thought of this story. Let us know some other angles that we should be thinking about with this story. Always like hearing from our readers. I think you guys are brilliant and come up with great discussions. Borges playlist down below for future talks. My name's been Una. Thank you for spending time with us today. Peace.
Peace.